So let's talk about one small but interesting change to Warhammer 40K's point system that could potentially unlock a whole load of interesting uses for units if Games Workshop continues to roll it out in the way that they've done so far. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I wanted to focus on one thing that maybe wasn't the headline act of the balance update, but certainly could be an interesting option for a whole bunch of armies going forward, many of which have already got one of these changes. Before 10th edition in Warhammer 40k, generally the points that you paid for models in your squad were done per miniature included. You'd have a little table like this, with say Chaos Space Marines having a unit size anywhere between 5 and 10 models, and then you pay 18 points per model, and then add any war gear out of that list that you included. For this one it'd be 18 points per legionary, so you could have anywhere between 5 and 10, and then multiply by the amount that you'd taken. I feel like often with list building it often made sense to go for a round number, either going for a minimum size squad for the smallest possible investment to do their battlefield role, or going for a big round number because you often tended to unlock extra war gear choices if you did that. Say maybe being able to take an extra special weapon in a unit or something like that. It was quite nice to have the flexibility. Often it did make sense to have things kind of mid-size if you wanted say just the right number to make the squad into a viable melee threat. We only had so many points to go round, and it could mean that finishing off certain lists could be a little bit easier. Pay for a few more 5-point upgrades or a few more cheap infantry models, and that maybe felt a little bit more flexible and easier to manage versus 10th edition, where I guess you mainly have to do that with enhancements if anything. As we know, 10th edition changed all that for simplicity. Now the point section for each unit tends to be really quite short and sweet. Say for example Space Marine Assault Intercessors with jump packs, you previously would field them in squads of either 5 models for 80 points or 10 models for 160. It did kind of irritate people a little bit that you now have to go for either the higher number or the lower number, often very much dictated by the amount of models that you get in the box set as opposed to anything else. I feel like perhaps Games Workshop didn't want the mid-sized units to be a good idea. Technically you can still field them that way. You could take 9 jump intercessors if you want to, but you'd still have to pay for 10. So outside of certain very specific situations, like say trying to cram the most marines into a drop pod, it would rarely ever make sense to leave one behind. War gear costs went away as well, but I'll not focus on that one for this particular video. That's a big topic in and of itself. I feel like they likely had a few reasons for doing this. 10th edition seemed to be all about simplicity and ease of access. Maybe they saw this as one thing that could be trimmed down fairly reasonably, at least with their initial focus of making 40k super easy to access, and maybe to make things easier for their army construction app. It might have also been motivated by ease of balance. It makes it kind of straightforward to tweak a unit if the only thing that you're going to be looking at is the top line number and whether to dial it up or down a bit depending on whether they're getting played loads or not. And I feel like maybe the box set thing might have motivated that as well. Maybe not wanting, say, a newer player who's collecting some Space Marines, picking up a box of 5 of them, and then weirdly because it makes some sort of arcane reason to field, say, 7 or 8 of them in a given army list, having to go out and buy another box and then just not use 3 of them. They've certainly had a bit of a drive to tie the unit datasheets as closely as possible to the actual products that you can buy. In general though, one feature of this was that the points cost almost always tended to be very symmetrical. If you had 5 Assault Intercessors, then it'd be 80 points, if you had 10 it'd be 160, and there were only really quite a few things that didn't follow that formula, maybe things like Devastators or Scourges, units where you can only take say 4 heavy weapons in a squad, so say if you take a bunch more bodies then they won't get the fancy fun heavy guns, so it makes sense that the second half will be a bit cheaper. It seems though in the last balance update, Games Workshop has decided to roll that kind of idea out to a whole bunch of different things. They had used that change for a few scattergun units before, but now it seems to be out in force. Quite a lot of factions have at least one example of it. Now there's plenty of units out there that you're basically taking more or less of the same sort of models, but they've decided to make the points cost of those squads asymmetrical. So say for example, Chaos Space Marine Legionaries, it's 90 points for 5 models now, but 170 per 10, slightly under double. And it's even more so for Assault Intercessors. 5 models is now 90 points and 10 models is 160, so that's a difference on 20 points versus the doubled value. Certainly in previous editions before 10th edition it wasn't really something that they tended to have a massive option to do. They always listed as points per model and never specified the first 5 models are this amount and then the reinforcement ones are this amount, at least maybe besides a few very edge cases. And to be honest, even if they did, either in early 10th edition or late 9th edition, I kind of feel like game balance for a lot of factions just wasn't sufficiently good enough where you'd care about this kind of thing. There'd be far bigger problems for Games Workshop to fix, likely as not. This might be a bit more impactful now they've got probably the majority of the armies having the majority of units viable for them. Obviously there's all sorts of bad examples you can point to, but the general trend is fairly positive. It's kind of interesting to see the units that they've gone for this. I guess for these examples, the jump intercessors tended to be really quite an easy to use and commonly played unit for jumping around doing actions and things, and you'd almost always want a small squad to do that, as they can do an action just as well as a big squad, so you might as well divide your resources and take 2 different squads of them if you're planning to spend 160 points. For the most part, it just didn't make sense to run big 10-man squads of them, though certain armies like Raven Guard and Blood Angels could do if they wanted. For the legionaries, there might be a similar sort of utility kind of argument, and I guess this might also be a bit of a nod to the fact that their war gear is better on a 5-man squad as well. Both the legionaries and the jump intercessors can take the fancy power fist on their sergeant models too, and you don't get a second one of those if they're expanded to a 10-man squad. That's definitely not the only motivation for this though, as plenty of units don't follow that pattern. I think it's an interesting change because currently at the moment, as things stand in 40k, many squads just 100% make sense to either run big or run small. And if you just flatly double the points cost from one to the other, you basically just never see one variant in optimized lists. As well, they might be usable, they just don't really make sense versus other options. Maybe good examples of that could be things like Space Marine Intercessors. You'd rarely ever find them fielded in 10s in any sort of list trying to do well. Their roles to hold and contest points, which you can equally do with a 5-man squad. Cheap units of troops are kind of handy to have, being a little bit more sacrificial, maybe doing screening and things. You still get their special rule whether or not they're a small squad or a big squad. And again, given that they've got a sergeant, you get their fancy war gear only one time per squad, and you don't get that again if you expand to the doubled up squad. It can be the exact opposite for a whole bunch of other units though. These ones typically tend to be damage dealers or combo style units in one way or another. Say Necron Canoptech Wraiths could be a good example. They're priced a fair bit more than they used to be, and a sort of price for their efficiency that they can get with a Technomancer with a big feel no pain, and it makes sense to run him with a full squad of Wraiths rather than 3, as you're basically getting double the bang for the buck on the big squad. Otherwise they might also want to be kind of critical mass to be able to have enough melee to threaten some serious damage fairly reliably on a fair few units, and their damage isn't exactly stellar, so it certainly doesn't hurt to have a bit of volume for reliability. They're a good target for Canoptech Court stratagems, like say the reactive movement, which is pretty powerful on a big chunky unit, and I guess for Necron specifically you've got a better chance to survive to reanimate some wounds. For an example from the Space Marines, maybe I'd take the Aggressor Squad. They're basically in the position where they pay a big points premium for the amount of damage that they can spit out between their shooting and melee, and due to the amount of points that you pay for it, it makes sense to basically heap as many buffs on them as possible and make sure they can get there to do what they do. And that means things like buffing characters like the Apothecary Biologist, maybe buffs like the Fire Discipline, any shooting or melee stratagems that might be going, and maybe a Land Raider to get them there nice and safe and protect all that investment. Basically all of that's going to be a lot more efficient on a big chunky unit of 6 of them, rather than spending those stratagems, characters or transports on a smaller squad. Obviously there's loads of things that can happily run as either a max size unit or a smaller one, but maybe those ones feel like there are a few good examples where it tends to be fairly cut and dry for the majority of strong lists at least. I do find it interesting though that if Games Workshop is going to start giving units a different points cost for a big one and a small one, they basically could unlock new ways to play those units in an efficient way. Say maybe 3-man squads of aggressors could be a bit cheaper, as you're unlikely to get as much efficiency from buffing them, so maybe they could have a role as a cheaper disruption damage type unit as well, and still be good if not going all in. Or you could have intercessors being a 10-man squad and getting a fairly heavily discounted points cost. Say field a 10-man intercessor squad for 140 points or something like that, maybe more, maybe less, but you'd be rewarded by getting more marine bodies on the table, even if you're not getting a second power fist, or more special rules or anything like that. It could also have implications for characters and leaders as well. Maybe intercessors could be a far more interesting choice for certain leaders if you could get really quite a big cheap squad of them. Perhaps sort of unlocking a role for them as an actual big damage and defense type unit, as well as just the sort of actions and objectives 5-man squad role that they tend to get used for most now. In the last update they really have done this with quite a lot of units. The Chaos Space Marine Raptors also got the same treatment as the Legionaries, the bigger squad dropping down to 170 points. I feel like that's quite a good change. I'm not sure if it's enough to make the big squad viable to actually be used as a damage and defense type unit, but I feel like it certainly could be a step in the right direction to have them be a bit more credible as a damage threat with a Chaos Lord. For Accursed Cultist, they went the other way, the big squad going up to 195. I guess perhaps partly due to how much more powerful those reactive moves are on a really big squad that's unlikely to die to one round of firepower, and perhaps the big synergy that they can get with the Dark Commune as well. For the 1000 Tons Rubric Marines, it was interesting that the big squad actually went down a bit, where the small squad went up, I guess trying to promote them a little bit more in their damage dealing role as opposed to just their small unit, character guarding and cabal point farming type loadout, and the Zangor Enlightened went up to 50 points, I guess Games Workshop trying to nerf their small objective doers, while not making the 6-man squad that basically no one tends to use worse. The broadsides were a weird one. They decided to give the 3 model unit 300 points, essentially meaning that your last broadside basically costs 120 points, which was an odd idea. I guess they're trying to slightly punish any big synergy that you can put on a big 3 broadside firepower unit, that this feels like it's gone a bit too far. I've not seen anyone using more than 2 of them since. Jump Pack Death Company are weirdly more expensive for their 5-man squad, which I guess maybe could be to do with the fact that they get an extra power fist in their small squad. I feel like this one probably isn't one that they should have done, to be honest. They generally tended to be a bit more common in big squads of 10, with maybe Lamarties leading them before, even if the small squads were also viable. Maybe just a small squad and double it would be appropriate enough for them. Primaris Crusaders went up for the big squad in particular, so now cost more than double if you're running them as a 20-man block to make things like Tannhauser's Bones or Grimaldus's 5+ Feel No Pain get better. I guess perhaps the split cost for them isn't too unreasonable, though I still think it's just a shame that they went up that much in the first place and didn't really feel like a unit that needed nerfing. Sister Seraphim are interesting in a small squad of jump infantry that they decided to come down harder on the damage dealing combo, trying to make their hand flamers not quite as ridiculously potent in a big unit. They can get a lot of damage from devastating wounds. Grey Knight Paladins and Terminators are cheaper for the small squad, maybe trying to slightly discourage 10-man Terminators, doing painful movement shenanigans like Mists of Deimos, though really quite a lot of Grey Knight lists often just tended to field small squads anyway, as it's not like 5 Terminators isn't a big investment unit already. Chaos Warp Talons have the small squad cheaper. That one feels like it makes sense, as the big squad can get massive value from spending rapid ingress, then jumping in, killing something and going off the board again. It's just less efficient to spend 1 command point a turn if you're just doing that with 5 men. Drukhari Mandrakes have the small squad that people tend to take going up. Infiltrating units often tends to have the small squad taken more than the big squad. And to be honest, I feel like split points could be pretty appropriate for most of those. The Eldari Wraithblades and Wraithguard have the smaller squad cheaper, I guess due to synergies with things like the -1 to wound that Farseers can give them. Votan Einhir Hearthguard have the same, a cheaper smaller squad, as I guess quite a lot of people like to teleport in a big squad of 10 of them with the sustained hit stratagem and just absolutely shred some things. I still thought the small squads were okay already, maybe jumping out of land fortresses. And the same is true of the Genestealer Cult Aberrants, 135 for the small squad and 300 for the big. They generally tended to get most played in Biosantic Brood Surge, perhaps more than anything else. There often tend to be 10-man squads in that, though I saw some people using smaller ones, I guess partly due to critical mass and being good with leader characters and things. Finally, there's a whole load of things that maybe feel like they're doing things for a different reason, extremely small squads that have point costs of less than 50. Games Workshop seems to have decided that most of these should have the smallest model cost a little bit more, just because a tiny squad in Warhammer 40K has got plenty of value all of its own, being able to do things like screen out deep strike, do actions and contest objectives, and maybe do things like nuisance charges on things that can't kill them. Again, that seems kind of sensible if they want to limit the roles of those units a little bit within their codexes. It doesn't really make sense to take it out on the bigger versions of the squads of these units, like say the 3 squads of Pyrovores or 9 squads of Nurglings, as it's not exactly them that's causing the problem. Overall, it's definitely a small interesting new move with Games Workshop and how they're treating 10th edition's points. At first impressions I do really quite like this. I think it makes a lot of sense and could add some interesting options when list building in a codex. I guess it might mean that there's a little bit more mental load when trying to remember unit points cost and things. You can't just remember literally one number and then double it for multiples if there's going to be a lot of units like this. But given all the other point systems that we've had in Warhammer 40k, 10th edition is already about as simple as it gets. In any case though, I'll be interested to hear your guys' thoughts. What do you make of the change? And are there any units that you'd like to see have a different points cost from a big one to a small one? And what do you make of the units that Games Workshop's done it to already? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about most days. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages. seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.